The universe Hal Jordan enters is ordered by distance and restraint. Vastness is mapped into sectors, authority distributed across an architecture meant to prevent excess. Power exists everywhere, but it is never supposed to belong fully to anyone. It is loaned, measured, watched. The promise of this system rests on a quiet assumption that limits are not an obstacle to heroism, but its condition. Without borders, force becomes chaos. Without rules, intention dissolves into impulse. Earth stands at the edge of that system, peripheral yet symbolic, a place defined less by cosmic wisdom than by raw momentum. It produces pilots, explorers, figures drawn to speed and altitude rather than contemplation. Hal Jordan emerges from this terrain not as an anomaly, but as its purest expression. He is not shaped by caution or reverence. He is shaped by velocity. The sky is not a ceiling to him, but an invitation. Gravity is not a law, but a challenge waiting to be answered. Before any crisis announces itself, before any fracture becomes visible, the conditions are already in place. Hal does not seek power in order to dominate. He seeks it to remove friction. Every obstacle feels unnecessary. Every boundary appears arbitrary. Limits are not experienced as guidance, but as insult. This disposition does not yet read as corruption. It reads as confidence. In a culture that celebrates breakthrough and defiance, his posture appears not only acceptable, but exemplary. The ring finds him not because he doubts, but because he does not. It responds to will, not reflection, to forward motion, not pause. In that moment, the universe affirms something already alive in him. That force bends when he pushes. That reality responds when he insists. The transaction feels clean, almost ethical. He is given power because he wants it badly enough to carry it forward without hesitation. The system believes it has found a perfect instrument. What remains unseen is the cost of this alignment. A will that has never learned to negotiate with constraint does not experience authority as stewardship. It experiences it as extension. The ring does not introduce excess. It amplifies what is already there. The constructs he creates are not careful. They are decisive. They fill space. They occupy territory. They do not ask permission. This is celebrated as clarity, as courage, as leadership under pressure. Around him, an order persists that depends on mutual containment. Guardians who govern by distance rather than engagement. Laws that assume obedience not because they are perfect, but because they are necessary. Their power lies in duration, not intensity. Hal exists in tension with this from the beginning, though no one names it yet. He obeys. He performs. He succeeds. And with every success, the contradiction deepens. The world before collapse is stable precisely because the conflict has not been acknowledged. Hal believes himself loyal to the structure that empowers him. The structure believes his energy can be absorbed without distortion. Both assumptions rely on silence, on the idea that as long as victories continue, no further inquiry is required. The universe appears whole. Its fractures are internal, invisible, waiting. Loss enters this system not as tragedy, but as data. It tests whether power can compensate for absence, whether force can reverse gravity. When something irreversible occurs, Hal does not grieve within the limits provided. He reacts against the premise itself. Finality becomes the true enemy. Death is not accepted as boundary, but framed as a failure of imagination. If the universe allows such outcomes, then the universe is insufficient. At this stage, nothing breaks outwardly. The system absorbs the shock. Hal remains operational, functional, even heroic. Yet something subtle shifts. The center of gravity moves inward. Authority no longer feels like a shared structure. It feels like a ceiling pressing down. Rules that once seemed neutral now appear obstructive. Distance reads as indifference. Restraint begins to resemble abandonment. Power, once experienced as alignment, starts to feel incomplete and less total. Partial control becomes intolerable. The ring still responds. The constructs still hold, but their meaning changes. They are no longer tools within a framework. They become proof. Evidence that limits exist only because someone insists on them. The question is no longer how to serve the order, but why that order refuses to expand to meet the scale of his will. The world does not yet call this dangerous. It calls it intense. It rewards results. It narrates his actions as necessary escalation. Each success pushes the boundary outward. Each exception becomes precedent. The structure bends without breaking, and this reinforces the belief that it can bend forever. No one asks what happens when bending becomes the only mode of operation. What forms here is not villainy. It is absolutism without malice. A conviction that if something can be done, it must be done. That hesitation is weakness. That limits are a failure of courage rather than a condition of coexistence. The universe becomes a field to be corrected, not a system to be maintained. Order shifts from collective balance to personal resolve. The opening sequence closes not with an explosion, but with a narrowing. A hero at the center of a widening sphere of influence. A system increasingly reliant on a single axis of will. The stage is set not for rebellion, but for inevitability. Once power is understood as the removal of limits, any boundary becomes an enemy by definition. The conflict has not arrived yet, but it has already chosen its direction. Hal Jordan's origin does not begin with cosmic artifacts or alien authority. It begins with exposure, to altitude, to speed, to environments where hesitation is punished immediately. His formative space is not domestic or communal, but mechanical and aerodynamic. The cockpit becomes an extension of self. Control is not abstract. It is tactile, responsive, immediate. When something fails, it does so decisively. Survival depends on decisiveness, not deliberation. This environment does not teach moderation. It teaches mastery under pressure. The early loss that marks his internal landscape does not introduce fragility. It introduces a vacancy where limits should have been metabolized. Death arrives without meaning, without explanation, without consent. Instead of producing humility, it produces a refusal, not articulated as denial, but as orientation. The world is not allowed to be final. Endpoints feel like errors rather than truths. What cannot be prevented must be overcome. This becomes the unspoken logic that structures his adulthood. Within this psychological terrain, authority is respected only when it proves itself operational. Hal does not rebel against rules out of spite. He ignores them when they slow him down. Hierarchy is tolerated when it aligns with momentum, disregarded when it imposes delay. This makes him appear adaptive, pragmatic, efficient. In fact, it reveals a deeper incompatibility. His sense of legitimacy is grounded in outcome, not structure. If something works, it deserves to exist. If it fails, it forfeits its claim to obedience. The cosmic order that recruits him is built on a radically different premise. It assumes that power must be distributed precisely because it is dangerous. That distance preserves coherence. That restraint is not weakness, but architecture. Its guardians are not warriors, but curators of scale. They operate from a center removed from consequence, believing that separation ensures clarity. Their authority is impersonal by design. It is meant to survive individual collapse. When Hal enters this system, the mismatch is immediate, though initially productive. He thrives where others hesitate. He improvises where protocols stall. His will fills gaps the system cannot address quickly enough. This earns him trust, visibility, symbolic centrality. He becomes the exception that proves the rule. Or so it seems. In reality, he becomes the pressure point through which the system tests its own elasticity. The ring functions as both instrument and mirror. It does not impose intention. It magnifies it. For a subject already oriented toward expansion, it becomes an amplifier of certainty. Constructs emerge not as careful approximations, but as declarations. Solid, oversized, occupying territory decisively. They do not adapt to environment. They override it. This visual language matters. It reflects a psychology that values presence over negotiation, force over calibration. The order interprets this as courage. The audience reads it as charisma. Hal becomes visible not only within the narrative world, but within the cultural imagination surrounding it. He embodies a particular fantasy. That willpower alone is sufficient. That complexity can be simplified through resolve. That responsibility is best carried by those least inclined to doubt themselves. This fantasy resonates because it aligns with broader cultural myths of individual exceptionalism. Yet beneath this admiration lies a fault line. Hal's identity fuses increasingly with function. He does not simply wield power. He becomes its most legible expression. The distinction between role and self begins to erode. When he acts, it is no longer clear whether he serves the order or corrects it. The system allows this ambiguity because it benefits from the results. Every crisis resolved through escalation delays the need for introspection. Trauma, in this configuration, does not soften. It sharpens. Loss does not produce withdrawal, but acceleration. The past does not demand mourning, but correction. This creates a psychology intolerant of stasis. Waiting becomes unbearable. Acceptance feels like surrender. The present is always provisional, something to be surpassed. This orientation makes Hal extraordinarily effective in emergencies. It also renders him incapable of coexistence with irreversibility. The guardians who oversee the system are aware of this tension, but misread its nature. They interpret Hal's resistance to limits as immaturity rather than incompatibility. They believe experience will temper him, that exposure to consequence will produce balance. What they fail to grasp is that consequence, for Hal, does not instruct. It provokes. Every failure confirms not the need for restraint, but the need for greater force. As crises escalate across the universe, the system increasingly relies on him. This reliance is structural, not personal. His presence fills gaps the architecture cannot address. Over time, this shifts the center of gravity. Authority begins to migrate from distributed order to concentrated agency. Hal does not seize this position. It forms around him. He becomes the axis through which resolution occurs. This concentration has symbolic weight. It reframes heroism not as participation in a system, but as transcendence of it. The hero is no longer one who upholds balance, but one who exceeds it. Limits are recast as obstacles to progress. Restraint is reinterpreted as cowardice. The moral field narrows. What matters is not whether an action preserves structure, but whether it produces immediate correction. Within this narrowing, ethical complexity erodes. Nuance becomes inefficiency. Dissent reads as obstruction. Dialogue feels indulgent. The universe, in Hal's experience, increasingly resembles a cockpit under constant threat. There is no time to debate when altitude is dropping. No room for consensus when velocity determines survival. This metaphor dominates his perception, even when the conditions no longer justify it. The foundation of the conflict is not a fall from virtue, but a collision between two models of order, one grounded in distributed restraint, the other in concentrated will. Both claim legitimacy, both produce results, but they cannot coexist indefinitely. As pressure increases, the space for ambiguity collapses. The system must either reassert its limits or surrender them. Hal does not articulate this conflict consciously. He experiences it as frustration, as impatience, as the sense that others are failing to see what is obvious. His certainty feels earned, forged through loss and repetition. To question it feels not only wrong, but dangerous. If will is the only reliable force against chaos, then doubting will becomes a moral failure. The narrative groundwork is thus laid, not for betrayal in the conventional sense, but for escalation beyond containment. The system has empowered a subject who does not recognize the legitimacy of limits. It has done so repeatedly, visibly, successfully. The conditions that will later be named catastrophe are already normalized. Power has been framed as solution rather than problem. By the end of this phase, the conflict is no longer theoretical. It is embedded in daily operation. Hal remains a hero by every external measure. But internally, the terms of heroism have shifted. Service has become indistinguishable from correction, authority from possession, protection from control. The system continues to function, but its foundation is under strain. What comes next is not a sudden break. It is the inevitable articulation of what has been present all along. When limits finally assert themselves in ways power cannot override, Hal will not adapt. He will respond as he always has, by pushing harder. The first visible deformation of the system occurs not through rebellion, but through necessity. A crisis arrives that cannot be solved cleanly, not because it lacks force, but because it contains loss that no intervention can reverse. This is the moment where the architecture of restraint expects acceptance, where damage must be absorbed rather than undone. Hal encounters this not as tragedy, but as structural failure. The universe presents an outcome he cannot correct, and for the first time, power does not feel sufficient. His response is escalation framed as responsibility. If the system cannot protect what matters, then the system is incomplete. This logic does not announce itself as revolt. It appears as urgency, as refusal to tolerate preventable damage. Hal's actions push against established protocols, not to defy authority, but to bypass delay. Each boundary crossed is justified by outcome. Each rule ignored is rendered irrelevant by success. The system registers this as deviation, but rewards it all the same. What shifts here is not behavior, but interpretation. Hal begins to experience the rules not as safeguards, but as obstacles imposed by those unwilling to act. The guardian's distance reads no longer as wisdom, but as insulation. Their refusal to intervene directly becomes morally suspect. In this reframing, power that is not used to its fullest becomes complicity. Restraint becomes a luxury afforded only to those untouched by consequence. As pressure increases, Hal's interventions grow broader. He no longer responds only to immediate threats. He anticipates. He preempts. Territory becomes something to be secured proactively rather than defended reactively. This expansion feels logical within his internal calculus. If danger is inevitable, then control must be comprehensive. Partial oversight appears negligent. The universe begins to feel less like a shared field and more like a perimeter under constant threat. The ring continues to respond without hesitation. It offers no resistance, no moral feedback. Its silence is interpreted as affirmation. Constructs grow more imposing, less symbolic, more infrastructural. Walls, barriers, containment fields. Power shifts from expression to enforcement. What was once imaginative becomes administrative. Hal's will no longer paints possibility. It organizes space. It redraws boundaries unilaterally. Within the narrative world, this produces immediate results. Conflict decreases in zones under his direct influence. Order appears restored. Chaos recedes. Observers note efficiency, decisiveness, clarity. The system benefits materially from this consolidation, even as it erodes its own premise. Authority that once relied on distance now relies on proximity to Hal. The center tightens around him. Psychologically, this marks a critical transition. Hal no longer experiences himself as an agent within a structure. He experiences himself as the structure's corrective function. This distinction matters. When mistakes occur, they are no longer absorbed by the system. They attach to identity. Responsibility becomes total. There is no longer space for error, because error would invalidate the logic of unlimited intervention. Opposition emerges quietly at first, not as enemies but as questions, as reminders of jurisdiction, as calls for restraint. These are dismissed not with hostility, but with impatience. The language shifts subtly. Concern becomes obstruction. Dissent becomes weakness. The moral field simplifies. Those who hesitate are not wrong, but insufficient. Those who resist are not malicious, but irresponsible. The system attempts to reassert its limits through procedure, through review, through dialogue. These mechanisms, designed for balance, now feel glacial. Hal experiences them as abdication. Each meeting, each delay, reinforces the belief that centralized will is the only force capable of matching the scale of threat. The more the system hesitates, the more it confirms his worldview. Loss returns, sharper this time, not as isolated event, but as accumulation. Hal confronts the repetition of irreversibility. Each instance compounds the original wound. Each reinforces the conviction that acceptance is surrender. Grief does not slow him. It radicalizes him. The universe feels increasingly hostile not because it is chaotic, but because it refuses correction. Reality itself becomes the adversary. At this stage, polarization begins to crystallize. The conflict is no longer between hero and villain, but between models of order. Distributed restraint versus concentrated will. Preservation versus domination framed as protection. The system still names Hal a hero, but the meaning of that term is shifting. He is no longer exemplary. He is exceptional in a way that destabilizes the category itself. Public perception within the narrative amplifies this shift. Hal becomes a symbol not just of courage, but of decisiveness without apology. To some, he represents hope. To others, unease. But even dissenters struggle to articulate their concern without sounding abstract. His results are tangible. His certainty is compelling. The cost of opposing him appears higher than the cost of compliance. The transition out of this phase is not marked by collapse, but by consolidation. Lines are drawn not through declaration, but through behavior. The system adapts around Hal's expanding influence, even as it quietly loses coherence. What was once an exception becomes expectation. The rules still exist, but they no longer govern outcomes. Will does. By the end of this stage, the conflict has taken shape, not as a single act of transgression, but as a structural realignment. Hal has not abandoned the system. He has outgrown it in his own perception. The universe has not yet resisted fully, but it is no longer neutral ground. It has become contested territory. Resistance stops being procedural and becomes symbolic. The system no longer merely delays Hal. It contradicts him. Jurisdiction is asserted not as logistics, but as principle. Limits are named explicitly. This is the first moment where restraint ceases to be abstract. It takes form as refusal. The universe tells him no, not because it cannot comply, but because it will not. Hal experiences this refusal as betrayal. Not personal, but structural. The order that empowered him now questions the logic of his expansion. To Hal, this reads as inconsistency bordering on hypocrisy. The same system that praised decisive overreach in moments of crisis now invokes caution when consequences accumulate. From his perspective, the only thing that has changed is scale. The method remains identical. The objection therefore feels arbitrary. What emerges here is a reframing of legitimacy. Hal begins to locate authority not in mandate, but in capability. If someone can act and others cannot, then responsibility transfers automatically. Power becomes self-justifying. The right to intervene is earned through effectiveness. Any attempt to revoke that right feels disconnected from reality. The universe, in this framing, is governed by competence rather than consent. This is where will becomes ideology. No longer merely a personal trait, it hardens into a principle that organizes perception. Every problem appears solvable if force is sufficient. Every tragedy appears preventable if intervention is total. Complexity collapses into resistance that must be overcome. Ambiguity becomes camouflage for inaction. The moral universe narrows to a single axis of resolve. Hal's actions reflect this compression. Intervention becomes more permanent. Temporary measures feel irresponsible. Structures are imposed rather than suggested. Zones of influence become regimes of order. These are not chaotic or cruel in their intent. They are efficient, predictable, safe. But safety is purchased through uniformity. Difference becomes instability. Variation becomes threat. The ring's constructs mirror this transformation. Where once they were expressions of imagination, now they resemble infrastructure. Grids, barriers, enclosures. Space is no longer open terrain, but something to be managed. Territory is defined by coverage. What cannot be covered becomes suspect. The universe begins to feel smaller, not because it is conquered, but because it is contained. Opposition sharpens in response. Other figures within the system begin to recognize what is at stake. This is not a debate over tactics. It is a struggle over the meaning of order itself. To accept Hal's model is to concede that balance is secondary to control, that limits exist only until someone strong enough ignores them. This threatens the foundation of a system built on shared restraint. Hal does not interpret this opposition as principled. He reads it as fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of consequence. Fear of making irreversible decisions. In his internal logic, refusal to act decisively is itself a form of violence. Allowing harm through inaction becomes indistinguishable from causing it directly. This logic is airtight from within. It admits no exception. The emotional core of this phase is isolation masked as clarity. Hal believes he sees what others cannot or will not. This belief is reinforced by continued success. Order increases under his influence. Threats diminish. The immediate feedback loop remains positive. This strengthens the conviction that opposition is not only wrong, but dangerous. The universe, in his eyes, is being held hostage by its own caution. As confrontation becomes unavoidable, the system attempts containment. Not through force initially, but through removal. Authority is withdrawn. Access restricted. The intention is to reassert structure without escalation. For Hal, this is the final confirmation. Power is being limited not to protect balance, but to preserve hierarchy. The system appears more invested in maintaining its architecture than in preventing suffering. This is the moment where internal justification turns outward. Hal no longer merely bypasses limits. He challenges their legitimacy openly. His actions become declarations. The universe must choose between an order that tolerates loss and an order that eliminates it through absolute intervention. Neutrality is no longer possible. To stand aside is to endorse limitation. The psychological shift here is decisive. Hal's identity fuses completely with his function. There is no separation between who he is and what he believes must be done. Doubt would fracture the self. To reconsider would be to betray not only his mission, but the narrative that has sustained him through loss. Will hardens into necessity. Choice collapses into inevitability. Within the narrative world, this escalation reframes Hal from hero to axis of conflict. Every action now carries symbolic weight. Supporters see a guardian willing to do what others cannot. Detractors see a force that threatens the very conditions of coexistence. The universe polarizes around his presence. Alignment becomes unavoidable. Silence becomes position. This phase ends not with defeat, but with rupture. The system's attempts at containment fail to slow him. Authority fractures under the pressure of concentrated will. What was once a distributed order now faces a singular force that refuses to recognize its boundaries. The conflict has crossed a threshold. It is no longer about correction. It is about replacement. What follows will not be negotiation or reform. It will be consequence. The universe has allowed will to expand unchecked. It will now reveal what happens when limits are removed not from action, but from identity itself. Release does not arrive as surprise. A pressure that has been accumulating across structures, identities, and territories finally finds a single direction. Hal no longer operates against resistance. He operates beyond it. The system he once served ceases to function as reference. Its objections register only as noise from a framework already surpassed. What remains is a singular project, to rebuild reality according to a logic where loss is no longer permitted. At this stage, power is no longer instrumental. It becomes ontological. Hal does not simply enforce order within the universe. He seeks to redefine what order is. The distinction matters. Enforcement implies an existing rule set. Redefinition implies authorship. The universe shifts from arena to material. Something to be reshaped, compressed, corrected. Territory is no longer defended. It is redesigned. This transformation is not driven by cruelty. It is driven by coherence. In Hal's internal economy, contradiction has become intolerable. A universe that allows preventable suffering is structurally flawed. If the flaw cannot be repaired locally, then the architecture itself must be replaced. What emerges is not tyranny in the conventional sense, but absolutism framed as repair. The promise is not domination, but completion. The psychological cost of this posture is totalization. There is no longer space for plurality. Every alternative model of order becomes threat by definition. Opposition is no longer misjudgment, but error at the level of reality. Those who resist are not enemies. They are inconsistencies that must be resolved. This resolution may take the form of containment, suppression, or erasure. The method is secondary to the outcome. The universe responds not with immediate collapse, but with distortion. Systems designed for balance buckle under the weight of singular will. Feedback loops vanish. Resistance loses coherence because it lacks a center of gravity comparable to Hal's. The conflict becomes asymmetrical. One side represents a closed circuit of certainty. The other represents a fractured coalition of restraint, ethics, and memory. Hal's presence amplifies everything around him. Every action reverberates across the symbolic field. Supporters experience relief. a sense that someone is finally willing to shoulder the impossible. Detractors experience dread, not because chaos has increased, but because contingency has disappeared. A world without limits is not infinite. It is narrow. It admits only one solution at a time. At the level of identity, Hal has crossed a point of no return. He no longer remembers himself as someone who chose this path. It feels inevitable, as if every prior step led here without alternative. This perception is crucial. It absolves him of doubt. Responsibility becomes indistinguishable from destiny. The self dissolves into function. There is no Hal apart from the project of total correction. This dissolution produces a strange calm. The agitation that once drove escalation fades. There is nothing left to argue with, no authority to negotiate, no boundary to test. The universe, as Hal experiences it, has become legible, predictable, manageable. This calm is often mistaken for enlightenment. In reality, it is the silence that follows the elimination of opposition. The narrative world registers this as transformation rather than victory. Familiar landmarks vanish. Relationships lose meaning outside alignment. Moral language thins. Concepts like consent, plurality, and autonomy become artifacts of a previous order. The universe has not ended. It has been simplified, reduced to a single axis of coherence. Yet this simplification carries its own instability. A system without internal tension cannot adapt. Without friction, movement loses direction. Hal's model of order depends entirely on his continued presence. His will has replaced structure. His certainty has replaced dialogue. The universe now rests on a single point of failure. This is where consequence crystallizes, not as punishment but as exposure. The system reveals what unlimited intervention actually produces. Not harmony but dependency. Not safety but stagnation. Not peace but suspension. Life persists, but it no longer moves freely. It waits for instruction, for correction, for permission. Hal does not experience this as loss. He experiences it as success. The absence of chaos confirms his logic. The silence validates the method. What he cannot perceive is what has been removed to achieve this stillness. Uncertainty, difference, the capacity for the universe to surprise itself. The collapse that follows is not explosive. It is structural. The system cannot sustain a reality where all limits have been absorbed into a single will. The weight becomes unmanageable. The very force that enabled expansion now produces fracture. Power, concentrated beyond circulation, turns inward. The architecture begins to fail not because it is attacked, but because it cannot distribute strain. Hal's fall is not framed as defeat by an external enemy. It is framed as exposure to consequence he believed he had eliminated. Loss returns not as isolated event, but as systemic revelation. The universe cannot be perfected without being diminished. Control cannot eliminate tragedy without eliminating freedom. These truths assert themselves not through argument, but through collapse. By the end of this phase, the conflict has reached its irreversible articulation. The attempt to abolish limits has revealed their function, not as obstacles, but as conditions for movement, difference, and survival. Hal stands at the center of a structure that has proven both powerful and unsustainable. The hero who could not accept limits has shown what happens when limits are removed entirely. What remains now is not restoration, but residue. The marks left on the universe, on identity, on cultural imagination. The conflict has concluded its motion. Its meaning is about to begin. The transformation of Hal Jordan does not remain contained within the narrative universe that produced it. It radiates outward, reshaping how power, heroism, and responsibility are imagined by those who witness it. His trajectory becomes a symbolic event, not because it is unprecedented, but because it articulates a tension already alive in the culture that tells his story. The conflict he embodies mirrors a broader discomfort with limits in an age that equates possibility with virtue. Within the fictional world, institutions fracture not simply because they are attacked, but because their underlying assumptions are exposed. Systems built on distributed restraint depend on shared belief in the value of limits. Once a figure demonstrates that those limits can be overridden successfully, belief erodes faster than structure. Authority becomes performative. Rules persist, but their legitimacy thins. The audience watches not a rebellion, but a delegitimization. This dynamic resonates culturally because it reflects a familiar pattern. Societies often tolerate extraordinary concentration of power when it produces immediate relief. Efficiency becomes a moral argument. Speed becomes ethical proof. Hal's rise reflects the seduction of results-driven authority, where outcomes justify the erosion of process. The discomfort arises only later, when the costs become diffuse and harder to narrate. Hal's image splits along symbolic lines. To some, he represents the hero unburdened by compromise, a figure who refuses to accept inherited limitations. He becomes an avatar of corrective force, the fantasy that someone finally will take responsibility for everything. This reading does not require cruelty. It is sustained by exhaustion. The exhaustion of living within systems that move slowly while suffering accumulates. To others, Hal becomes a warning, not because he turns against life, but because he narrows it. His universe grows quieter, more stable, less surprising. The fear he provokes is not fear of chaos, but fear of finality. A world where decisions are no longer negotiated feels safe until one realizes there is no appeal. This fear is difficult to articulate because it opposes efficiency without rejecting order outright. The cultural power of this conflict lies in its refusal to resolve cleanly. Hal is not easily dismissed as villain, nor can he be reclaimed as misunderstood hero. His logic is coherent. His motives are legible. This ambiguity forces the audience into reflection rather than allegiance. The question shifts from who is right to what kind of order feels survivable. Media environments amplify this tension. Stories of decisive intervention travel faster than stories of gradual balance. Visual language favors spectacle over maintenance. Hal's constructs dominate space. They are visible, monumental, immediate. Restraint, by contrast, leaves little to show. Its successes are absences, disasters that did not occur. This asymmetry shapes perception. Power that acts loudly feels real. Power that holds back feels abstract. As a result, Hal's model of heroism gains symbolic traction beyond his narrative. He becomes shorthand for uncompromising resolve, for the idea that hesitation is the true enemy. This shorthand circulates not because it is accurate, but because it is simple. It compresses complex ethical trade-offs into a single image. A figure standing alone, imposing order through force of will. The opposition to Hal struggles symbolically because it lacks a comparable image. Distributed restraint does not personify easily. It resists embodiment. This makes it vulnerable in cultural memory. Systems without faces lose narrative ground to individuals with conviction. Hal's story exposes this imbalance, not by arguing against restraint, but by demonstrating how easily it is overshadowed. The conflict also reframes trauma in cultural terms. Hal's refusal to accept limits reads as strength in societies that valorize overcoming. His inability to metabolize loss becomes invisible because it manifests as action rather than collapse. This reflects a broader pattern where grief expressed as control is praised, while grief expressed as acceptance is misread as weakness. The narrative critiques this not through condemnation, but through consequence. In the aftermath of Hal's transformation, the fictional universe must contend with a changed symbolic landscape. Authority is no longer assumed to be protective. Power is no longer neutral. Intervention is no longer automatically heroic. These shifts linger even after the immediate crisis resolves. They alter how future conflicts are framed, how solutions are evaluated, how figures of authority are trusted. For the audience, this produces a lasting unease. The story does not reassure. It does not restore the previous order uncritically. Instead, it leaves behind a heightened awareness of the cost of clarity, of how seductive it is to believe that limits are optional, of how easily the desire to eliminate suffering can become a justification for eliminating difference. Hal Jordan's cultural significance rests in this exposure. He embodies the fantasy of limitless correction and reveals its underside, not through moral lecture, but through narrative weight. His presence forces a reckoning with the question many systems avoid. What is lost when nothing is allowed to fail? This question persists beyond the confines of the story. It echoes in political imagination, in technological ambition, in social movements that promise total solutions. Hal becomes a mirror rather than a model, a figure through which the culture examines its own impatience with complexity. The symbolic impact of his arc is therefore not cautionary in the traditional sense. It does not instruct the audience to reject power or ambition. It asks something more difficult, to consider whether the refusal of limits is itself a form of fear. Fear of grief, fear of uncertainty, fear of living in a world that cannot be fully controlled. What remains after Hal Jordan's arc is not a repaired universe, nor a fully repudiated one. It is a landscape altered by proximity to absolute will. Structures reassemble, but they do so with memory. Authority returns, but it carries scars where legitimacy once felt self-evident. Limits are restored, yet they no longer appear natural. They must now be justified, defended, explained. The system survives, but innocence does not. Hal himself becomes a figure suspended between function and cautionary residue. He is not erased from history, nor comfortably archived. His name continues to circulate as reference point rather than lesson. Future actors invoke him both as warning and as proof. Proof that decisive action can bend reality. Warning that bending does not mean sustaining. His legacy refuses to stabilize into a single meaning. Psychologically, what endures is the image of a self that collapsed into purpose. Hal's inability to separate identity from intervention leaves behind a template of heroism that is both compelling and dangerous. The hero who cannot stop acting, who cannot relinquish authorship, who experiences restraint not as wisdom, but as betrayal. This template persists because it aligns with a deep cultural fantasy. That someone somewhere can finally take responsibility for everything. The aftermath reveals how seductive that fantasy remains even after its costs are visible. The quiet left behind by Hal's imposed order is remembered by some as peace, by others as suffocation. This split does not resolve. It reproduces itself in new conflicts, new figures, new crises. Each time the system hesitates, his shadow appears. Each time restraint feels inadequate, his logic resurfaces. The universe does not return to balance. It returns to negotiation. Limits are no longer assumed to be sufficient. They must compete with the memory of what it felt like to live without them. This competition destabilizes authority long-term. Every future rule is measured against the possibility of override. Every delay is haunted by the question of whether someone else would have acted faster. Culturally, Hal's story crystallizes a modern myth, not of the fallen hero, but of the hero who refused finitude. He becomes emblem of a deeper tension between care and control, between protection and possession. His arc does not argue that power corrupts inevitably. It reveals something subtler. That power without internal boundaries does not know where to stop once it begins. The myth persists because it does not moralize. It observes. It shows how good intentions can harden into necessity, how trauma can masquerade as clarity, how refusal to mourn can become refusal to share the world. Hal is not undone by hatred or envy. He is undone by coherence pursued too far, by a vision of order that cannot tolerate what it cannot fix. In the collective imagination, this places him among figures who expand the map by breaking it. His presence forces a reckoning not with evil, but with excess certainty. He exposes the fragility of systems that depend on restraint when confronted by someone who believes restraint itself is the problem. This exposure cannot be reversed. Once seen, it remains available. The aftermath also reframes the idea of responsibility. Hal's story complicates the assumption that taking responsibility always means acting more. It introduces the uncomfortable possibility that responsibility sometimes means enduring what cannot be corrected, that refusing to intervene can be an ethical position rather than a failure. This idea struggles to gain symbolic ground, precisely because it produces no spectacle. Yet it is here that the deepest legacy settles, in the tension between what can be done and what should not, between capacity and consent, between force and coexistence. Hal Jordan becomes less a character than a question that refuses closure. How much order can one will impose before the world becomes unlivable? The conflict does not end because the conditions that produced it remain. Loss still occurs. Systems still falter. Power still promises relief. The temptation to remove limits never disappears. Hal's arc ensures that this temptation is never again innocent. It carries memory now, weight, history. In this sense, the legacy is not redemption or condemnation. It is density, a thickening of meaning around the idea of heroism itself. The figure who once stood for fearless ascent now also marks the danger of ascent without horizon. The sky remains open, but it is no longer empty. What endures is the recognition that limits are not merely barriers. They are the negative space that allows movement to remain shared. Remove them entirely, and motion collapses into command. Hal Jordan's story leaves that recognition embedded in the mythic record. Not as rule, as pressure. The hero who could not accept limits does not vanish. He lingers as gravitational force within the narrative universe and beyond it, a reminder that the refusal of boundaries is itself a choice, and that every choice, no matter how well-intentioned, reshapes the world in ways that cannot be fully controlled.